This is topic 5.11 and 5.12 for AP Environmental Science, Ecological Footprints, and the Introduction to Sustainability. Make sure that as we go along, you are filling in your study guide or your learning targets using the learning targets that are at the top of each slide. The first one here comes from the course and exam description. I can explain variables measured in an ecological footprint. So let's talk about an ecological footprint. Now, notice that the word here, land, is bold. It's a measure of the land and water an individual person uses, or a population uses, or an activity uses to produce all the resources consumed and the process that waste is generated. And we measure this in land. So a lot of times kids, if they're going to describe an ecological footprint, they say, well, it's the impact of a person on the environment. That is not correct. It is not precise. An ecological footprint is the amount of land and water needed. So actually just think of land needed to produce all the food you eat, all of the plants that go into things like cotton for your clothing, or mining for your electronics, or mining for fossil fuels, or drilling for oil for a car. All of that land processes goes into the ecological footprint. So when we look at an ecological footprint of a person, the energy needed to drive a car, to turn on lights, to cook with, to heat with, the amount of land you need to live on, what is your house like, or an apartment or a condo, timber and paper, so all the paper you use, whether it's cardboard boxes from Amazon or paper at school, the food that you consume, the fibers would be like clothing that you use, the seafood eaten, and so all of these things make up your ecological footprint. And notice it's a footprint of land space. So again, let's talk about the variables. We have the food eaten, the water used, energy, clothing, housing, and transportation, and it's the land required. So people in developed nations like the US have a larger footprint because we have more money to buy more things. Okay, so here's the ecological footprint for different countries. Now, the United States is a developed country, but so is Germany. And so you can see that US people have bigger houses, bigger cars, more land. We consume more items than people in Germany do, even though Germany is also a wealthy country. And then these are our developing countries, China and India. As developing countries become developed, they use more and their carbon footprint increases. Okay, so let's talk about carbon footprint now. So carbon footprint is not an ecological footprint. It is the carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, both from things you directly do, like drive a car, a gas-powered car, not an electric car, although electric cars have to plug in. And how is that electricity generated? So if you have an electric car and your electricity at your house is generated through burning natural gas or coal, you are still using fossil fuels and emitting carbon into the air by charging your car. Okay, so you can pause the video, you can take a look at all of these items that go into a carbon footprint, whether it's your land use, your waste, your petroleum refining, your road transportation, etc. Okay, so here's a little pie chart here of our transportation carbon footprint. Now, your individual carbon footprint also includes the trucks it takes to ship your items. Because if you buy something at the store, whether it's food or whether it's an Xbox or an iPhone case or a shirt or a hat, boats had to bring that item to you, and so the boats will emit carbon into the atmosphere by burning diesel to go across the country, across the ocean, and then the trucks to bring it to your store. And then if you order it, the trucks to deliver it to your house, or if you drive to the store, the car that you drive to the store. All of those things factor into your individual's ecological footprint. And then this is for food. So you can see that meat creates more carbon per person than other food products do. All right, let's move on to sustainability. It's the ability to use a resource or engage in an activity without jeopardizing the ability of future generations to engage in similar activities. So how do we use resources and make sure there's enough for our children and our grandchildren? So what if something's renewable? If it's a renewable resource, means it comes back within less than 100 years. So things like trees will grow back, water will come back through the water cycle, the sun comes back every day. Soil takes the longest. It's 100 years to generate an inch of topsoil, but it is like the longest renewable resource. But however, if we use a renewable resource too fast, it can become non-renewable or unsustainable. The most important factor in the problem of sustainability is the population size. More people require more resources. And so how do we provide these resources without doing too much harm for the environment that makes it unlivable for our children and our grandchildren? All right, so developed nations consume more resources than developing nations. So developed nations are your wealthier nations, went through the Industrial Revolution sooner than others. And you can see here in dark red, it's the highest footprint. So Canada and the US have the highest ecological footprint. There's also a country up here, I think that might be Poland, that also is high. Some other reds, Australia has a high ecological footprint. And then the lowest here are in green and dark green for ecological footprints. There are other wealthy countries that do not use as much land for their goods, foods, etc., even though their income levels are high for their people. Look at these countries in Europe, even Japan. So the United States is the leader in that. All right, down here, as developing countries get wealthy, they start to use more resources. They want to live like Americans. Okay, sustainability. Here's our human population. This is a review from Unit 3, and you can see how it's grown exponentially. And so in order to meet the needs of an increasing human population, we want to make sure that our environmental systems are monitored so we don't damage beyond the ability to recover. Our renewable resources should not be depleted faster than they regenerate, and our non-renewable resources should be used sparingly and also recycled. All the metals and things can be recycled. Well, not all, many, most. Okay, and then development is like building homes and businesses and schools and factories and power plants. That's development. So how do we create these things that are good for the economy and also make sure that they're good for future generations? That's called sustainable development. Okay, part of this principle of sustainability is called maximum sustainable yield. How much can we take out? How much lumber can we harvest so there's still a forest for our species? Remember, forest is not just for the species, but forests help humans with carbon sequestration, purifying the air, purifying the water. But we also need lumber to build our homes, to create paper from. What is our maximum sustainable yield to make sure there's still forest? We make sure that we plant back the trees. How much, deer hunting in places where they hunt deer, there's a quota, there's a license you have to get, and they figure out how many deer can be killed so that they still have enough population to grow back the population. Same thing with fisheries, maximum sustainable yield. So Maximum sustainable yield is difficult. If you want to go into the field of environmental science, working for fisheries or fish and wildlife or forest service, you can be a scientist in those fields to help figure out policies with maximum sustainable yield. How do we make sure we have enough for the future? And that can be tricky. So sometimes you may determine, oh, we can take 80,000 pounds of king crab out of the ocean in Alaska. But maybe 2 years later, when the populations didn't recover, we go, oh, that was too much. And so we adjust. So sometimes we don't know until later that our maximum sustainable yield wasn't quite correct. Another thing is externalities. So what are the problems that come with harvesting fish or trees or whatever it is? There's other things that could happen. If we remove too many trees, there's an externality like more air pollution that really isn't factored in the ability to grow back the forest. Okay, so we also need to understand that there are environmental indicators. So if we want sustainability, if we want sustainable development, we need to make sure that we're monitoring our, and here's the list down here, biodiversity, the ability to continue to grow food at a good level. What's our surface temperature on the globe? What's our CO2 concentration in the atmosphere? What's our human population? What's our resource depletion? So these are things that help us understand if we are doing a good job with sustainability or not. And it's complicated. So you can pause the video and take a look at this table here of all the things that are environmental indicators. And let's go on. Okay, so here's some questions to think about and to put on your study guide. What are some ways governments can help maintain sustainable yields? Remember, these are solutions also to tragedy of the commons. So establishing quotas, limits. For example, where I live, there's a lake called Castaic Lake. It's recreational fishing, and there are limits and quotas. There are only certain species that you can fish out of there and a certain number per day, and you need a fishing license. And if you are caught violating those quotas, limits, or not having a license, you get a fine. Okay, describe ways that a green roof increases sustainability. So green roofs are where you grow plants on your roof, and they can remove pollutants from rainwater. They can take in carbon from the air. They can release oxygen through photosynthesis. They can insulate a building, which lowers heating and cooling. So these are all things that can be added to sustainability. Okay, so the remainder of this little PowerPoint is an introduction to climate change and some other environmental indicators that are covered later in our units in AP Environmental Science. As far as the study guide goes, you do not need this information for this topic and this unit going forward in this video, but I'm just going to continue the video to just kind of give you an indicator of some things that we look at, especially we're going to look at later in our course. Worldwide biodiversity, we actually looked at with Unit 2. We'll revisit it in Unit 9. It has been declining globally, indicating systems are not healthy and humans are not living sustainably. Food production has grown and has kept pace with population growth, so our food production is in good shape. There has been, however, our food supply so far able to feed 8 billion people, not a problem. We can probably feed another couple of billion people, but our yields can't go up forever, and there are some signs of stress. And we are not certain if they can in the future with more population growth. Now in the US, we'll be fine. We have way more food we produce than our population. But other countries may not be. And you can see here, if you want to pause the video, you can take a look at grain production over time. Okay, we're looking at our average global surface temperatures and carbon dioxide concentration. These things can affect biodiversity and food production. Solar energy is trapped by the thickness of the atmosphere, allowing the planet to become livable. These are greenhouse gases. So greenhouse gases you will learn about in Unit 9. You also learned about them earlier in a chemistry class. And additional greenhouse gases can lead to a warmer planet. And then there are other anthropogenic changes, fossil fuel burning, and other carbon activities. And again, climate change is covered in Unit 9. This is just a little preview. This is a little preview of greenhouse effect here. More details to come later. But these are all things we think about when we're figuring out sustainability, and that's why it's covered briefly right now. You can see our average global temperature and atmospheric CO2 concentrations have been rising since the 1800s. And most of all, in terms of sustainability, it's our human population growth, more people, more resources, and as they become wealthy and become more developed, they want more of those resources. So making sure that we monitor the resources, renewable and non-renewable, is an important job to do. It is a field that you can go into for a career. You can pause the video if you'd like and take a look at this graphic, which talks about developing nations and developed nations resource use. And then here's our indicators, biological diversity, etc. that we talked about. Here's the recent trend. Here's the outlook for the future and the impact on environmental quality. Again, you can pause the video and take a look at those. Going through these things can give you some background that will make learning these things easier as we get to them in other units. All right, that concludes our lecture.